but instead branches off and goes this direction with Paul. Well, if the theory is true, and I tend to think that it is, if the theory is true that Luke and Acts were specifically written to document the fact that the Christian faith was not a subversive movement in the sense that it was seeking to set up a rival political system to the Roman system, which, of course, was what people were saying. You either have to say Kaiser Kurios, Caesar is Lord, or Jesus is Lord. You can't say both. Well, that's true, but there's a reason, and it has to do with the kingdom of heaven, the kingdom of earth, and so on and so forth. If Luke wrote Luke and Acts as an amicus brief, as something that was going to be submitted to document what the background of Paul's teaching and stuff were, then it would make perfect sense. You have to start with Jesus. You have to give the story of Jesus. And then you have to give the story of the early disciples, but then once Paul comes along, is his trial in Rome, so you're going to talk about him. You're not going to fill up pages and pages of papyrus with writing about somebody else that would be irrelevant to the situation with Paul. So it actually makes sense. I think it's one of the strongest arguments for that view of Luke Acts, that it goes that direction. But even then, Luke had to choose what stories he told, what information he included. There's all sorts of stuff that clearly wasn't included because it covers years and years of time in the amount of space that could be read in just a fairly brief amount of time. So every historian has to choose how you're going to tell your story, what your standards are going to be in light of what you're attempting to communicate. When a historian writes a introductory book of church history, Banner of Truth has one that has all sorts of pretty pictures and stuff like that in it. Well, guess what? It doesn't go very in-depth. Because if it's going to be introductory, it can't go very in-depth. It's just, you're going to select material based upon your audience and what you want to communicate to them. When I first took church history in seminary, we had to read Kenneth Scott Lauderette's 2-volume set on church history, and I've frequently described it as exciting as chewing aluminum foil. I was mentioning that while I was in England, and I had to change to the proper pronunciation, aluminium. You might go, really? Yes. Across the pond, it's aluminium. So chewing aluminium foil. Anyway, it's pretty dry stuff, but each volume's yay thick, and they're paperbacks. I never saw. You could always tell who was actually doing their reading assignments in the church history class. That book could not possibly be read fully without falling apart. The spine was just too big. So you could tell the students who were having to stick parts of their book back in, they were actually doing the reading. The guys whose books were in good shape, they weren't doing that reading. No way. Just to get to the inner part, you had to break that binding, and it would just start falling apart. But anyway, in the pastor's office, there are 2 sets of Schaff's 8-volume History of the Christian Church. You get a little more detail there, But even then, Schaff has to sit there and go, how do I organize this? And generally it ends up being in a chronological sense, but you can't just do chronology and make that make any sense. If you want to talk about Augustine lives for a long time. Lots of other stuff happens while he's alive. So again, the point is you always have to keep that in mind when looking at any historical source, is how did the author choose to relate these things? So when we look at church history, obviously one of the issues we do need to deal with to have some type of understanding is the soil out of which the church is growing, the world into which the church is going. And obviously, the first and primary context of the New Testament is Judaism. It is appropriately said. Now, there's a bunch of movements out there, by the way, right now. Weird stuff on the internet, and I'm not just talking about the the Black Israelite movement or Black Hebrew movement, something like that. Yeah. Wow. I'm not talking about on another planet weird type stuff, but that is other planet weird stuff. But there's like the Hebrew roots movement, and there's all these folks on quote-unquote Christian television hawking books about how the secret to understanding the New Testament is to recognize it was not originally written in Greek. And it was originally written in Hebrew, you see. And so once you go back to the Hebrew, now there's a little problem with that. First of all, the vast majority of scholars do not believe that. There's one early church father by the name of Papias. And we don't have any of Papias' original writings, but we have Papias being quoted by everybody else. That's not the best way of having sources, but that's how we know something about him. And evidently Papias is quoted to have said that Matthew, I'll get to it eventually, Matthew originally wrote his gospel in Hebrew. Well, one thing's for certain. The Gospel of Matthew we have today was originally written in Greek. It's not a translation of a Hebrew original. You can tell when someone's translating from one language into another. When we look at the Greek Septuagint, you can tell it's a Greek translation of a Hebrew original. Matthew was a Greek original. Every book of the New Testament was written in Greek originally. There really isn't any question about that amongst serious scholars of the subject. And so there is no Hebrew New Testament to go back to. So when people sell you the Hebrew New Testament, they're making it up. They had to choose what Hebrew words to use based upon the original Greek. And so when people mislead others by saying, well, originally that wouldn't, in the Aramaic would have been, in the Hebrew would have been, blah, 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 they don't know what those originally, even when Rome, some of you have seen some of my debates with Roman Catholics down through the ages. It's getting to be that long, down through the ages, starting in 1990. You know that in regards to papacy, there's constant argument, constant assertion that, well, Jesus said to Peter, on this rock, you're Peter, rock, and upon this rock I'll build my church. And the original Aramaic would have been Kepha. Well, the fact of the matter is, you don't know. A, that he was speaking Aramaic, and B, what the original Aramaic would have been. You don't know. It's a guess. And other scholars guess differently. Some scholars say it would have been Limna, not Kepha. So you can't build anything upon a foundation, superstructure upon a foundation that's that weak and that lacking. And so there is a lot of stuff out there. Just be aware of the looniness that is out there. But the fact is that